Men who never build anything should not lecture men who run companies.
My son-in-law raised his wineglass, looked straight at me, and said, "Men who never build anything should not lecture men who run companies." Everyone at the table laughed. What he did not know was that I owned the company he ran. Hello, my name is Samuel Whitaker. I am 63 years old, and for most of my life, I have learned more by listening than by speaking. I live in a modest 2-bedroom house outside Columbus, Ohio. I drive a 12-year-old Ford pickup. I cut my own grass, make my own coffee, and wear the same brown jacket every winter. To my son-in-law, Preston Hale, that made me an unsuccessful old man. Preston had been married to my daughter, Emily, for 4 years. When she first brought him home, he was charming. He remembered birthdays. He carried dishes to the sink. He talked about loyalty as if he had invented it. Emily was happy, and that was enough for me. 6 months after their wedding, Preston became Chief Executive Officer of North Star Industrial Systems, a manufacturing company with offices in 3 states. He told everyone he had earned the position through courage, intelligence, and relentless work. That was partly true. He was intelligent, and he worked hard when someone important was watching. But he did not know why the board had considered him in the first place. North Star belonged to a private holding company called Whitaker Group. I had founded North Star 31 years earlier in a rented warehouse with 2 machinists and a second-hand milling machine. After my wife, Laura, died, I stepped away from daily operations. My ownership was held through a trust, and my name disappeared from the company's public-facing material. Only the board chair, the general counsel, and the chief financial officer knew that the quiet majority owner was Samuel Whitaker. I wanted Emily to choose her own life without men pretending to love her because of my money. She believed I had sold my small factory years ago and retired comfortably. That was close enough to the truth. At first I watched Preston's progress with cautious pride. Then Emily began changing. She stopped laughing loudly. She apologized before expressing an opinion. When Preston interrupted her, she fell silent. She used to call me every Sunday. Now I heard from her once every few weeks, usually while Preston was out. Then, one Tuesday evening, Preston called me himself. "Emily says we should include you more," he said. "Dinner Friday. My parents will be there. 7 sharp. Wear something decent." He laughed after the last sentence, as if it were friendly advice. I accepted because I wanted to see how Preston behaved when he believed no one at the table could help or hurt him. Friday night, I parked my truck beside a row of luxury cars outside Preston and Emily's new house. The house had 6 bedrooms, a glass staircase, and a kitchen larger than my first factory floor. I had quietly given Emily the down payment as an early inheritance. Preston told people his executive bonus had paid for it. His mother, Vivian, opened the door. Her eyes traveled from my worn shoes to my old jacket. "You must be Emily's father," she said. "The retired mechanic." Something like that. Preston's father. Charles shook my hand without standing. He had spent his career selling commercial real estate and considered every conversation a contest. During dinner, he asked what my house was worth, whether my truck still ran, and if I had planned for nursing care. Vivian asked Emily whether she was embarrassed serving expensive wine to someone who probably preferred beer from a can. Emily's face tightened. "Dade knows more about wine than any of us." Preston put down his fork. "Emily, don't make everything defensive." That sentence told me more than the insult did. He had trained my daughter to believe that defending someone she loved was a character flaw. I remained calm. I asked Preston how things were going at North Star. He leaned back. "Better than ever. I inherited an outdated company and turned it around." "Inherited?" I asked. "Not legally. Professionally. The founder disappeared years ago, probably sitting on a beach, while younger men create the value." Charles smiled. Preston increased profits 22%. I knew the number. I also knew how he had achieved it. He had delayed machine maintenance, reduced safety training, and classified experienced employees as contractors. The profit looked impressive because the danger had not appeared on a quarterly report yet. Profit can be expensive, I said, especially when it comes from postponing necessary work. That was when Preston raised his glass and mocked me. Everyone laughed except Emily. I could have ended the performance then. I could have told him who I was and watched the color leave his face. Instead, I smiled. Maybe you're right, I said. A man should understand a company before criticizing its leader. Preston mistook restraint for surrender. After dessert, I went to the hallway for my coat. I heard voices from Preston's study. The door was almost closed. Charles said, "Once the board approves the acquisition, your position is untouchable." Preston replied, "Mercer is handling the votes." "And Emily?" Vivian asked. "She signs next week. She thinks it is a routine marital property update." I stopped breathing for a moment. Charles lowered his voice. "Her father cannot interfere." Preston laughed. "Samuel. He can barely interfere with a restaurant bill." I left without confronting them. In my truck, I called Margaret Ellis, Northstar's board chair. "Freeze Monday's acquisition vote," I said. She was silent for 1 second. "Samuel, what happened?" "I just met the real Preston Hale." By Saturday morning, I was no longer testing Preston's manners. I was investigating a threat to my daughter and the company I had spent half my life building. Margaret met me at Northstar's old administrative building. We used a conference room that had no electronic scheduling system. Daniel Cho, our general counsel, joined us with Chief Financial Officer Renee Alvarez. The proposed acquisition involved a logistics company called Calder Freight Solutions. Preston claimed Calder would reduce shipping costs and give Northstar access to a valuable distribution network. He wanted the board to approve a purchase price of $48 million. Renee placed 3 folders on the table. "Calder's reported revenue has doubled in 18 months, she said. But its cash flow has not. Preston keeps pushing us to rely on adjusted numbers supplied by Calder." Daniel added, "One of our outside auditors requested customer contracts. Calder delayed twice, then Preston ordered the audit team to narrow its review." "Who owns Calder?" I asked. "A chain of limited liability companies," Daniel said. "The final beneficial owner is not disclosed in the materials." I thought of Charles's words at dinner. "Once the board approves the acquisition, your position is untouchable." I authorized a confidential forensic review. Then I drove to Emily's house. She answered wearing an oversized sweater. There was a tiredness in her eyes that no amount of sleep could fix. "Dad, Preston is at the club with his father." "Good." I told her what I had overheard about the document Preston wanted her to sign. I did not yet tell her that I owned Northstar. That secret had protected her for years, but now I needed to reveal it carefully with proof. Emily looked confused. "He said it was for estate planning." "Have you seen it?" She brought me an email from Preston's personal attorney. The attachment was called a postnuptial clarification. Its language was dense, but its purpose was simple. Emily would waive claims to certain marital assets and acknowledge that Preston's future compensation, equity awards, and business interests were his separate property. Another clause made her responsible for debts attached to a consulting company Preston had opened in her name. "I never opened a consulting company," she whispered. "We searched the state business registry. There it was. Whitaker Strategic Partners, formed 8 months earlier, with Emily listed as sole member." Her digital signature appeared on the filing. She stared at the screen. "I didn't sign this." The betrayal was no longer emotional. It had a registration number. Emily began telling me things she had hidden. Preston monitored their shared accounts. He criticized what she wore before company events. He told her she was too sensitive whenever she questioned him. 3 months earlier, he had persuaded her to grant him limited financial power of attorney while she recovered from surgery. She had revoked it, or believed she had. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked gently. "Because he said you would overreact. And because I kept thinking if I explained myself better, he would become the man I married again." I took her hand. "You are not responsible for making dishonesty reasonable." I finally told her the truth about Northstar. At first, She thought I meant I owned a few shares. Then I showed her the trust documents, the board records, and a photograph of me standing in the original warehouse beside our first machine. You own all of it. 72%. The employees and other investors own the rest. She stood and walked to the window. Does Preston know? Knew. For the first time that morning, something stronger than fear appeared in her expression. Don't tell him yet, she said. That was my daughter returning. On Monday, Preston arrived at headquarters expecting an acquisition vote. Instead, Margaret announced a 10-day compliance review. He called it unnecessary and demanded to know who had ordered it. The controlling shareholder, she said. Preston had never met that shareholder. He referred to the trust owner as the ghost and assumed it was a distant investment family. That afternoon, the forensic team found the first hidden wire transfer. Northstar had paid Whitaker Strategic Partners $300 for executive advisory services. The invoice bore Emily's forged signature. The money had moved through her company and then into a second account controlled by Preston. The next discovery was worse. Calder Freight's largest customers were shell companies. Several shared addresses, phone numbers, or officers with businesses linked to Charles Hale. Calder's value was inflated. If Northstar paid $48 million, millions would flow to Preston's family, while Northstar acquired debt, old trucks, and invented revenue. It was not a bad deal, it was a planned robbery. That night Preston called me. Samuel, I need you to speak to Emily. She is acting paranoid about some paperwork. What paperwork? I asked. Nothing important. She listens to you because she still sees you as some wise working-class hero. And what do you see me as? He sighed. A man who should be grateful his daughter married above her station. I wrote the sentence down. Then I said, bring the papers to dinner on Thursday. Explain them to both of us. He agreed immediately. He thought he was coming to collect Emily's signature. I was inviting him to document his own deception. Thursday's dinner was held at my house. Preston arrived in a tailored navy suit and looked around my small living room with open disappointment. Charles and Vivian came with him. Emily arrived separately and parked where she could leave without being blocked. I had made pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Vivian called the meal nostalgic. Charles asked whether my dining table was real wood. Preston placed a leather folder beside Emily's plate. This is the document we discussed, he said. It protects both of us. Emily opened it. Why does it make me responsible for Whitaker Strategic Partners? For half a second, Preston's expression changed. Then the smile returned. That is a dormant entity we created for tax planning. We, she asked. You signed the formation documents? No, I didn't. Charles interrupted. This kind of suspicion is unhealthy in a marriage. I asked Preston to explain the $380,000 Northstar had paid the company. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. How do you know about that? Emily showed me a bank notice. It was a believable answer. He looked at her with cold fury. You went through confidential records. They are in my name, Emily said. Vivian leaned toward her. A wife should not humiliate her husband over technical details she does not understand. I had heard enough. Then help us understand, I said. Why did the money leave Emily's company and enter an account controlled by Preston? Silence filled the room. Preston recovered first. He claimed it was a reimbursement. Charles called it normal business. Vivian accused Emily of trying to destroy a successful man because she was jealous. Then Preston made a mistake. He said, Northstar approved every payment. Who at Northstar, I asked. The CEO has discretionary authority. So you approved a payment to a company secretly created in your wife's name, then transferred the money to yourself. He pushed back his chair. You are not qualified to question me. Sit down, Preston. My voice was quiet, but he sat. I placed a small digital recorder on the table. Ohio law allowed a participant in a conversation to record it. Daniel had confirmed that before dinner. This conversation is being preserved, I said. You may leave at any time. Charles stood. This is absurd. Emily spoke before he could move. If everything is legal, why are you afraid of a recording? Preston looked from her to me. He understood that the obedient wife and harmless father-in-law he had counted on were gone. He changed tactics. Emily, I made choices for our future. When the Calder acquisition closes, I will have enough influence to secure us permanently. Who owns Calder? She asked. Charles's face turned pale. Preston said he did not know. I opened my own folder and slid a corporate ownership chart across the table. At the end of the chain was Hale Meridian Holdings, controlled by Charles. Vivian whispered, "Where did you get that?" "From people who understand technical details." Preston stared at the chart. "This proves nothing. It proves you recommended that North Star buy your father's inflated company without disclosing the conflict." He pointed at me. "You have no authority at North Star." I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I placed my original North Star founder's badge on the table. The photograph showed me at 32, with dark hair and a serious face. Beneath it were the words Semel Morshetakar Fo UNDR. Preston looked at the badge, then at me. That could be fake. I added a certified trust statement, showing my controlling interest. Then I turned my phone around. Margaret Ellis and Daniel Cho were waiting on a secure video call. "Good evening, Mr. Hale," Margaret said. "The board's special committee has completed its preliminary review." Preston's lips parted, but no sound came out. I said the words he had never imagined hearing from the man whose truck embarrassed him. "I am the controlling owner of North Star." Vivian sank into her chair. Charles grabbed the ownership chart and examined it, as if a missing line might save him. Preston turned toward Emily. "You knew." "Not when I married you," she said. "And that is the only reason I ever learned who you really are." Margaret read the committee's resolutions. Preston was suspended immediately. His building access, company accounts, and authority were revoked. The acquisition was canceled. Evidence of suspected fraud, forgery, self-dealing, and wire transfers would be sent to outside counsel, the insurer, and appropriate authorities. Preston's face twisted. "You cannot do this to me. I built that company." I looked at him calmly. "You delayed maintenance, frightened employees, manipulated earnings, and tried to sell us your father's debts. You did not build North Star. You climbed onto it." He stood and shouted that Emily had betrayed him. Then he demanded she leave with him. She removed her wedding ring and set it on top of the unsigned postnuptial agreement. "My attorney will contact yours," she said. Preston reached for the folder containing our evidence. I moved it away before he could touch it. At that moment, two security professionals Daniel had arranged stepped through the kitchen doorway. They did not threaten anyone. They simply made it clear the dinner was over. As Preston left, he turned back. "This company will collapse without me," I answered. "It survived 31 years before you learned its name." The next morning, the story moved faster than Preston could control it. North Star announced that its CEO had been placed on leave pending an independent investigation. We did not publish accusations. We published facts. The acquisition was suspended, operations remained stable, and an interim leadership team was in place. Preston called board members individually. None returned his calls. He tried to enter headquarters, but his badge failed. Employees watched through the glass as the man who used to make them wait outside his office stood in the lobby demanding recognition. The interim CEO was Renee Alvarez. She had spent 11 years cleaning up problems Preston later claimed to have solved. On her first day, she restored the maintenance budget, paused the contractor reclassification program, and opened a confidential channel for employees. The reports arrived by the dozens. Managers described pressure to change dates on safety inspections. A procurement employee produced emails showing that Preston had directed contracts toward vendors connected to Charles. An executive assistant revealed that Preston used company travel for private weekends, then ordered staff to describe them as investor meetings. Our forensic accountants traced more than $2 million through false consulting agreements, inflated invoices, and related companies. Some transactions had failed. Emily's forged signature appeared 11 times. She filed for divorce, and obtained an order preventing Preston from moving marital funds. Her attorney challenged every agreement signed during the period when Preston controlled her financial access. The fake consulting company became evidence against him instead of a weapon against her. Preston's revenge was immediate and ugly. He told friends that Emily had conspired with her rich father to steal his career. He claimed I had hidden my ownership to trap him. For years, secrecy had protected my daughter from people attracted to wealth. Now Preston tried to present that protection as a crime. I did not argue online. I did not leak photographs or give interviews. Real justice does not need a dramatic voice when documents can speak. 3 weeks later, Northstar filed a civil action seeking repayment and damages. Calder's lenders began asking questions about its revenue. 2 supposed customers vanished from their registered addresses. Charles's partners turned on one another. As soon as they understood that the acquisition would never rescue them, Vivian called Emily and begged her to think about the family. Emily replied, "I am thinking about the family. I am protecting myself from yours." That sentence made me prouder than any board vote ever had. The criminal process took longer. It always does. Investigators interviewed employees, examined devices, and followed the money. I will not pretend every wrong was punished instantly. Preston had expensive lawyers. Preston blamed an accountant. Both men described obvious decisions as misunderstandings, but consequences arrived one careful step at a time. Preston was formally removed as CEO for cause. That decision canceled unvested equity and triggered repayment provisions in his compensation agreement. His professional reputation did not disappear because I made a call. It disappeared because the record showed what he had done when he thought no one powerful was watching. Charles lost control of Calder during a restructuring. Assets were sold to cover secured debts. The Hale family's country club membership, vacation property, and carefully maintained social image could not survive the bills that followed. The civil case ended in a settlement that recovered a substantial part of Northstar's losses. Certain details remained confidential, but one condition mattered to me: Preston could never again claim that he had left voluntarily after a disagreement over strategy. The company record stated the truth. Emily moved into my house for 4 months. At first, she apologized for everything, using too much cabinet space, leaving a light on, crying during breakfast. Each apology showed me how small Preston had taught her to become. One evening, I found her sitting on the back steps with a box of old photographs. She held a picture of herself at 16, standing beside me in the original Northstar warehouse. "I remember this place," she said. "You told me it belonged to a friend. I was trying to give you a normal childhood. Were you ever going to tell me?" "Yes. I kept waiting for the right time. Then waiting became a habit." She nodded. "Your secret protected me, but it also left me unprepared." She was right. That was the hardest lesson for me. I had believed quiet protection was always noble. Sometimes silence creates an empty space, and a liar is happy to fill it. I apologized to my daughter, not for Preston's choices, but for hiding so much that she had doubted her own understanding when his stories did not make sense. We rebuilt our relationship with more honesty. Emily returned to work as an occupational therapist. She rented a small apartment near her clinic and chose every piece of furniture herself. The first time I visited, she laughed because the kitchen table cost less than 1 chair in Preston's dining room. "It is real wood," she said. We both laughed until we cried. At Northstar, Renee accepted the permanent CEO position after a full board search. We created an employee safety committee with authority to stop dangerous work without executive approval. We also expanded ownership grants for long-term employees. The people who protected the company when its leader exploited it deserved more than a thank you email. I began visiting the factories again, not as a hidden owner inspecting people, but as the founder listening to them. Some employees recognized my name. Most did not. That was fine. Respect meant more when it was not demanded by a title. About a year after the dinner, I received a letter from Preston. He wrote that he had lost his marriage, career, friends, and future because I had humiliated him. He never mentioned the forged signatures. He never mentioned the stolen money or the workers he had endangered. At the end, he asked whether I had enjoyed my revenge. I considered answering. Then I placed the letter in the case file and closed the drawer. Revenge would have been destroying him because he insulted my clothes, my truck, or my home. I did not do that. I gave him time, authority, and every opportunity to show his character. When he believed I was powerless, he showed it clearly. When the truth arrived, I simply stopped protecting him from the consequences. These days, Sunday dinner is at Emily's apartment. We eat at her inexpensive wooden table. She speaks without asking permission, laughs as loudly as she wants, and never apologizes for taking up space. My old truck is still running. My brown jacket is still hanging by the door. North Star is stronger than it was under Preston, and I still live quietly. But I no longer confuse quietness with secrecy. If there is one thing I learned, it is this: never judge a person by the price of his coat, the age of his truck, or the size of his house. Power does not always enter the room wearing a tailored suit. Sometimes it sits silently at the table, listens to every lie, and waits for the truth to finish the job.